I'm John Strum, and this is Real Talk MS. It's November 5th, and we have a lot to talk about. For so many very real reasons, being a teenager is hard. So imagine for a moment that in addition to everything else that teenagers have to endure, you're a teenager who's been diagnosed with MS. And maybe the physical symptoms aren't that bad, but your ability to participate in after-school activities or just hang out with your friends is impacted by MS-related fatigue. The typical adolescent anxiety over something someone posted on social media evolves into depression. And cognitive issues begin to make it harder for you in the classroom. This is an unfortunate reality for many adolescents who are living with MS. Joining me to discuss how MS affects adolescents and how families can help manage MS is Dr. Ann Yeh. Dr. Yeh is a professor of pediatric neurology at the University of Toronto and the director of the MS and Neuroinflammatory Disorders Program and Fellowship Program at the University of Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children, known as SickKids. Dr. Yeh is also a senior scientist and co-director of clinical trials at the SickKids Research Institute. But before we get to my conversation with Dr. Yeh, there are a few other things you should know about. November is National Family Caregivers Month, and as someone who spent 23 years as an MS caregiver, I appreciate that since 1997, the U.S. has designated the month of November to acknowledge the often invisible contributions made every day by 53 million unpaid family caregivers across the United States. If you're caring for a friend, family member, partner, or spouse who's living with MS, I have some news to share with you. But before we get to that news, it's difficult for me to talk about caregiving without taking a moment to talk about the lifelong contributions to raising awareness and providing support for family caregivers led by former First Lady Rosalynn Carter. Mrs. Carter once said that, quote, "There are only 4 kinds of people in the world. Those who have been caregivers, those who are currently caregivers, those who will be caregivers, and those who will need a caregiver." And over the course of her lifetime, Mrs. Carter filled every one of those roles. In 1987, Mrs. Carter founded the Rosalynn Carter Institute for Caregivers, an organization dedicated to supporting family caregivers through leading research projects and strategic initiatives, developing and implementing evidence-based programs, and advocating for public policy that recognizes and supports the role of the family caregiver. Rosalynn Carter passed away 1 year ago on November 19th, and the work of the Rosalynn Carter Institute for Caregivers, along with her decades of public service and her advocacy on behalf of women's rights and mental health, all serve as a lasting legacy of one of the most remarkable and perhaps underestimated First Ladies ever to grace the White House. The progressive nature of MS means that at some point, a significant number of partners, parents, extended family members, and even friends will care for a loved one living with MS. That care can range anywhere from offering emotional support and managing medications to assisting with every basic task of daily living. The progressive and long-term nature of MS means that MS caregivers take on a responsibility that can increase over time and last for decades. And research shows that these contributions come at an unacceptably high cost, as caregivers themselves face a significantly increased risk of reduced health and well-being. It's not unusual for an MS caregiver to turn to the internet for information. Information about MS, but also information about how to be a great caregiver without losing yourself in the process. And one of the best things about the internet is the seemingly endless amount of information that's available on any subject you could possibly think of. Of course, one of the worst things about the internet is the seemingly endless amount of misinformation that's also available. And sometimes it can be difficult trying to separate the wheat from the chaff. identifying the good information from the not so good and sometimes completely wrong information. One of the things I learned as an MS caregiver is that caregivers don't have a lot of time. Caring for a loved one while trying to take care of your own everyday responsibilities can be burdensome. And while it's great to be able to turn to the internet for helpful resources and information, sifting through the information that isn't helpful to find the information that is helpful, well, that can just take more time and energy than a caregiver may have. So I Conquer MS created a Care Partner Advisory Board to actually review the available online information and resources and curate the most relevant, reliable, accurate, and supportive online resources for MS caregivers. These resources, curated by MS Care Partners for MS Care Partners, are featured in a web portal that will have its official launch in January. But you're invited to visit today as we begin its soft launch. You'll find this portal at mscarepartnerconnection.com. And if you're curious, you can check out a paper that's been published in the International Journal of MS Care that explains the concept, the details, and the steps that went into creating mscarepartnerconnection.com. You'll find a link to the website and a link to the paper in today's show notes. While we're talking about MS Care Partners, a Canadian research team wanted to better understand how symptom management impacted the caregiving role. Their study involved 475 MS caregivers who reported an average of 8 symptoms that were experienced by their care recipients. The most frequent symptoms reported were fatigue, weakness, and depression. And among the 8 symptoms that were identified by caregivers, balance or mobility impairment, depression, and vision difficulties were called out as being very difficult to manage. Care partners also pointed to a lack of available help in managing the diverse symptoms of MS. Now, if you'd like to review the details of this study, you'll find a link in today's show notes. Fatigue is one of the most common symptoms of MS, with experts estimating that it impacts upwards of 80% of the people who are living with MS. And unfortunately, it can also be one of the most disruptive symptoms. Fatigue is a symptom that gets in the way of fully engaging in almost every aspect of life, from job-related activities to those activities you might otherwise enjoy sharing with family or friends. A recent study by researchers at the University of Michigan Medical School and the University of Washington Medical School shows that treatment with modafinil, which is often prescribed to treat excessive daytime sleepiness caused by narcolepsy or obstructive sleep apnea, or cognitive behavioral therapy delivered by phone, both significantly reduced MS-related fatigue. Now, this study involved 336 people with MS who were divided into 3 groups. One group received a 12-week phone-based cognitive behavioral therapy program. A second group received treatment with modafinil, and a third group of study participants received combined treatment with both cognitive behavioral therapy and modafinil. The research team reported that 65% of the participants in each of the 3 groups reported clinically meaningful improvement in their fatigue. And a follow-up assessment that took place 3 months after the cognitive behavioral therapy was completed found the benefit of this treatment persisted. The researchers also reported that the study participants' sleep habits seemed to affect how well each treatment worked. Those study participants with poor sleep habits had better outcomes with cognitive behavioral therapy, and study participants with good sleep habits had better outcomes with modafinil. When you consider that fatigue impacts such a large percentage of people living with MS and there are not yet any approved treatments, this is encouraging news. If you'd like to review the details of this study, you'll find a link in today's show notes. Myelin repair represents a major area of focus in MS research. It feels like there's something more to report about remyelination every week. And this week is no exception. Researchers at Oregon Health and Sciences University have identified a plant-based molecule that can promote the growth of cells that produce myelin. This molecule, called sulforaphane, blocks the activity of an enzyme that is seen to be overactive in areas of myelin damage. By the way, this same enzyme has been shown to contribute to the growth and spread of cancer cells, so this discovery may have benefits beyond just MS treatment. The enzyme is called cell migration-inducing and hyaluronan-binding protein. That's a mouthful, so it's referred to as CEMIP. It naturally degrades hyaluronic acid and has been implicated in the development of MS. Now, hyaluronic acid is important in several natural functions, including tissue lubrication, cell migration, and wound repair. Studies have shown that the level of CEMIP is elevated in demyelinating MS lesions, leading to the production of certain hyaluronic acid fragments that can directly block oligodendrocytes from maturing. And just a quick reminder, oligodendrocytes are the cells that produce myelin. The research team screened a library of lab-made small molecules, hoping to identify a molecule that could inhibit the overproduction of this CEMIP. They also screened a large number of plant extracts, and they were able to identify one of the plant extracts, sulforaphane, as a powerful blocker of CEMIP activity in mouse oligodendrocyte precursor cells. Sulforaphane was also shown to be highly effective in promoting the maturing of oligodendrocyte cells. Now, I feel like I should apologize to you for using so many long sciencey words in describing this breakthrough discovery, but it's important enough that I wanted to share the news with you. So if I can break down this discovery even further, it's known that the overproduction of a specific enzyme seems to be related to demyelination. And the research team at Oregon Science and Health University have discovered a molecule found in plants that not only stops the overproduction of this enzyme with that very long name, but also promotes myelin-producing cells to mature. This is good news, and we'll be following the next steps in investigating how sulforaphane may represent a path to myelin repair. Now, if you'd like to review the details of this study, you'll find a link in today's show notes. Some surprising new evidence has been added to the already existing evidence that the worldwide prevalence of MS has been steadily increasing and now seems to be increasing at an even faster rate. The MS International Federation's Atlas of MS indicates that there are 2.8 million people living with MS around the world. That number, by the way, is from 2020, so you can expect it to increase when the Atlas is next updated. But this latest report comes from Australia, where the number of people living with MS increased by more than 50% between the years 2010 and 2021. To calculate the prevalence of MS in Australia, researchers analyzed prescription data for MS disease-modifying therapies that were part of a government database. DMT usage was also evaluated using data from the Australian MS Longitudinal Study, which collects data annually from about 2,500 people with MS, along with general population data from other government sources. Through their mathematical analysis, the researchers estimated that 33,335 people were living with MS in Australia in 2021. That's an increase of 56.6% from the year 2010, when the prevalence of MS in Australia was estimated to be 21,283. No doubt we can consider an increased awareness of MS and the ability to make more accurate MS diagnoses as a big part of the reason for this dramatic increase in prevalence. It could also be a function of changes in lifestyle factors. For example, obesity, smoking, and alcohol consumption have all been shown as factors that increase the likelihood of someone developing MS. But this increased prevalence of MS in Australia will have important implications for how healthcare resources are used throughout the country, as well as contributing to rising healthcare costs. The research team has indicated that they will continue analyzing data and will calculate new MS prevalence estimates for 2024 in their next report. Meanwhile, if you'd like to review the details of this study, you'll find a link in today's show notes. As we're seeing an increase in the overall prevalence of MS, the numbers of children and teens being diagnosed are also rising. Given the huge number of developmental changes that take place during childhood and adolescence, it's becoming increasingly important to understand how MS may impact those changes and how those developmental changes may impact MS. It's also becoming increasingly clear that managing MS in kids and teens requires a different approach than managing MS in adults. Dr. Ann Ye joins me in a moment to talk about managing MS in adolescents. MS occurs most commonly in adults, but it's being diagnosed in increasing numbers among children and adolescents. Joining me to talk about how MS can affect adolescents and how to manage MS as a family is Dr. Ann Ye. Dr. Ye is a professor of pediatric neurology at the University of Toronto and the director of the MS and Neuroinflammatory Disorders Program and Fellowship Program at the University of Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children, known as SickKids. Dr. Ye is also a senior scientist and co-director of clinical trials at the SickKids Research Institute. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Ye.
Thank you so much for having me, John.
So, how common is MS in adolescents, and what are the early signs and symptoms to look for?
So MS is relatively uncommon in adolescents, but to put it into context in the adults in comparison to adult MS, it occurs in about 10% of all MS cases. In terms of signs and symptoms to look for, MS in adolescents is much the same as in adults with MS, meaning a new onset neurologic symptom of, say, visual loss or visual decrease in visual acuity, or sensory symptoms or motor weakness occurring over in a what we would call a subacute fashion over the course of a few days is the usual way that people would present with MS in adolescence.
What about disease course? Does that appear to be different among adolescents with MS when you compare it to adults?
Well, the one thing that we've learned over the years is that younger people with MS, meaning adolescents with MS, seem to have a much more active disease course. They have more relapses and they have more disease activity, and that's demonstrated on MRI as well as in relapse number. What this means in sort of real terms or in terms of brain structure and integrity is that through time, there is a risk of greater levels of tissue loss through time. And really what it means in the big picture is that we feel as pediatric neurologists taking care of kids with MS, that there's an urgency to treatment early on to stave off the effects of these relapses.
I'm curious, has anyone been able to follow a group of these adolescents into adulthood? I'm wondering whether that increased relapse activity continues as they age.
Well, one of the good things that has happened in the last 10 years or so is access to high efficacy disease modifying therapies. So what we believe happens in most MS is that the early years are the ones where disease is most active. And what was seen in previous studies before disease modifying therapies were available was that there seemed to be a higher level of disease activity that leveled off after a few years. But we don't really see that so much anymore now that we have access to high efficacy therapies. It's a good thing. And I hope not to know whether early or late MS leads to higher relapses in the future because we all start early on with medicine.
Adolescence is a critical period of human development. Teenagers experience significant mental, emotional, and physical growth during adolescence. How does MS affect their development in these areas?
Well, John, we were just talking about the high level of disease activity in adolescents with MS. So that takes a toll on the brain and can take a toll on cognitive outcomes. And so one thing that we know is that through time, we see a sort of an increased trajectory of cognitive decline in kids with MS. And there have been several studies that have looked long-term at outcomes in kids that start out with MS that are now adults. The other thing that we see is that there are high levels of fatigue and depression, up to half of kids, maybe a third to, in some studies, up to 3/4 of kids with fatigue or depression. And what that means is that the normal or healthy social development may not occur as easily in kids with MS if they are suffering from mental health issues.
A moment ago, you mentioned high-efficacy disease-modifying therapies. What treatments are available for adolescents with MS?
There are many therapies available for adults with MS, and we in the MS field believe that pediatric onset MS is the same thing as adult onset MS. And all of the approved disease-modifying therapies for adults are actually being, almost all, not every single one of them, but almost all of them are being used in the pediatric population. On the other hand, access is a real issue because only one in the United States has been approved by the FDA. So we believe that most of the therapies for MS are probably effective in pediatric onset MS. Access is not so easy.
We were talking a moment ago about the high percentage of adolescents living with MS who are dealing with depression. What is the recommended course of treatment to help them best manage that?
Yeah, that's such an important question, John. First thing is to recognize it. And one thing that we know about adolescents is that they don't particularly like to talk to people about what's going on emotionally. And in clinic, they often hide things really well. And they may not tell their parents about some of their suffering or their sadness. And so the first thing we need to do is to recognize it and to use tools in our own clinical setting to ask the right questions. We use a brief screening tool to let us know if there are any adolescents at risk in our clinic so that we can recognize problems like depression, fatigue, and anxiety. And the second step is providing adequate supports for the child to respond to those mental health issues. Often we see children who are from places that are actually far flung from Toronto because of the rarity of the condition. And so it's important for us to know that there are places close to home where counseling can be received, and to link kids with those supports. Medication is another thing that is important if it's indicated. And so we rely on our colleagues in family medicine, pediatrics, and in psychiatry to help us with regards to treatment.
I know you've been involved in, multiple studies that looked at the benefits of physical activity for depression and fatigue and multiple sclerosis.
Yeah.
What have you learned?
Our studies to date have been observational studies. And in those studies, what we found is that there are associations with higher levels of physical activity and lower levels of fatigue and depression. And so we found in particular that kids that that are doing vigorous physical activity are more likely to have lower levels of fatigue and depression. And when we looked carefully at our data, what we found was that through time, longitudinally, that all the kids that we were observing tended to have slightly increased levels of fatigue and depression through time, but that if they had high levels of physical activity, they were that much lower in the depression scales and fatigue scales that we administered to them.
Are there specific types of physical activity that are recommended for adolescents who are living with MS that might help them better cope with that depression?
Yeah, there are. And so when you look at studies about what can help depression, it's actually hard to disentangle all of the things that might help, from the social milieu to the actual activity itself. But when you isolate physical activity on its own, vigorous physical activity seems to show the most benefit. But that doesn't mean that people need to go out right away and start, getting ready for a marathon or doing something that's way out of what they've done before. Because the first step to that is really just getting moving. And what I like to sort of think about when I think about physical activity is that it comes with a whole host of other things, because we know that there's a loneliness epidemic in North America, and getting up and out and getting your buddy or your friend to do stuff with you also decreases the social isolation that can actually compound some of the symptoms that people feel in relation to depression.
Physical activity and nutrition often go hand in hand. How does obesity affect adolescents with MS, and how can good nutrition help them manage some of their symptoms?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, John. So there have been a number of observational studies that have suggested that obesity or a high body mass index is associated with actually the risk of having MS. And so, and many people have asked the question about why that is. And to date, there isn't any really, really strong information about what it is, what the process is that associates obesity with MS. But what we know from our work is that physical activity is vigorous physical activity associates with all kinds of, I would say, positive outcomes. And so rather than focusing on obesity, we focus on getting kids up and out and active. The second part that you mentioned is that of diet and, dietary choices. And so we don't like to recommend for kids to go on diets because, the culture of dieting and restrictive food habits really does not lead to a lifetime of healthy habits. It leads to yo-yo dieting with weight gain and things like that. So what we encourage kids to do is to really think about their food choices, to focus on healthy choices like vegetables and less on fried foods, less on processed foods, and really leave it at that. I think having a diagnosis of MS is enough, and to put kids into a restrictive program may only be detrimental to their outcomes.
Very often, a teen who's living with MS doesn't know any other teens who are living with MS. How important is it for young people with MS and their families to connect with others who are in similar situations, and how can they find that kind of support?
Yeah, that's such an important observation, John. A lot of the kids that we take care of don't know anyone else with MS when they receive the diagnosis, and it's incredibly scary for kids and families. And what we found is that some families really find it helpful to talk to other families about the experiences they've had, and even to ask questions about, medications, medication choices, how they've adjusted to things. So in my mind, it's really important for people to be open to meeting other people and to learning from other people. Sometimes people aren't ready for that. So I don't tend to say, tell people that they need to do that. But if they ask, I will let them know of the resources, and we'll try to connect them with other people. There are a lot of resources out there for connecting people. The National MS Society is one example. There are special programs in the National MS Society that are focused on adolescents with MS. And this is true of any MS society around the world. MS Canada, where I live, has a number of different programs for connecting people. So I would recommend that people reach out to their MS Society and find those people. We also run teen programs, and we're always happy to have lots of teens from around the world joining if they'd like.
Well, Dr. Anye, I want to thank you for all you do to improve the lives of kids and families who are affected by MS. And thanks for talking with me today.
Oh, thank you, John. Thank you so much for choosing this topic and for including me. I'm really grateful, and I hope that you have a great day.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society, and you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/375. You'll find that link in today's show notes, so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or a text. And if you have a minute, I hope you'll visit the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and download the free Real Talk MS app for your iOS or Android smartphone or tablet. It's the best way for us to stay connected. The app will automatically download the latest episode of Real Talk MS. You'll be able to access any of our past episodes. You'll be able to save your favorite episodes. And it's a great way for me to share bonus content with you. The app is free, so I hope you'll download it today. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.